Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a beer, it's time for some Path of Exile discussion. Today I wanted to discuss the upcoming Atlas Invasion event. This is starting in less than 2 days' time, and is going to be a pretty crazy event in my opinion. The way that this is going to work is that you will be put into the normal core storyline of Path of Exile, and then after that into the mapping storyline. But every zone that you enter from very early in the game will have 5 additional bosses. These are pulled from the pool of monsters that a Maven can witness. So this means that you could encounter the Shaper while you're fighting Vaal in Act 1, or you could encounter the Synthete Nightmare while you are progressing through the Act 8 key. This is going to be a very difficult event, and it's going to require heavy bossing, but you're also still going to need to have powerful clearing characters as well. So for this reason, I think it's going to be quite cramping on build diversity. I'm not going to suggest a build for every Ascendancy like I did in Endless Heist. I'm just going to suggest a few builds because I think that this is going to be something where you bring your A game or you don't try. You're going to find you're just going to get smashed. If you play something that's off meta and bad, like I'm doing in Endless Heist, I'm playing a Slayer that is running Frostblades. If you play something as off meta as that, you are likely to just get smashed by the monsters once you hit a certain point in progression. I think that point in progression is going to be like tier 11, 12, 13 maps for most people. That's going to be where off meta builds are going to start to fail badly. Now, this is going to be a 10-day event, so don't expect to develop super strong characters. This is going to mean that you will have to be able to defeat some of these bosses without the crutch of powerful gear. This event will also be absolutely brutal in hardcore. So you can choose to play this as softcore or hardcore. You can choose to play it as solo self-found or as trade enabled. And that's up to you. Obviously, solo self-found makes it harder. Playing in hardcore makes it harder. But if you are playing in hardcore, you're going to want to log out instantly on hearing certain slam voice calls. If you hear Erased by Misery, then you have probably less than 2 seconds until the Shaper bonks you on the head, and that bonk will probably kill you. So you're going to want to log out immediately, then develop a plan. That plan might be to abandon the instance. If you're in a map and the Shaper appears, you might decide I'm not going to come back into that map. Or it might be to come back in and drop a decoy totem and then walk past the Shaper. Or maybe you feel confident that you can beat him. That's going to be up to you, but you're going to probably need to be a bit quicker on the logout trigger finger than you would be, say, in Endless Heist. So I wanted to mention a few just general boss notes because these will influence some of the things I say later about what builds are going to be effective and not. There's a number of monster stats that are hidden in the game. So when you're fighting, say, Conley the Unrepentant from the Basilica map, the game doesn't tell you Conley's hit points, but this data has been data mined, and it also can vary a lot with map tier. All the formulas for this have been worked out somewhere behind the scenes, and so players have a pretty good sense as to exactly how the relative durability of monsters compares. What's important though is that these stats will give some sense as to how much boss killing will be needed. So many of you will be familiar with how much time it takes to kill a boss like Stone of the Currents. Stone of the Currents is the boss of the Wharf map and has 400% as its life stat. So this will vary, like this will be 12 million if you're fighting this boss in a tier 16 map, something like 8 million I think if you're fighting it in a tier 13 map, and it'll fall off quite hard to, just a few 100,000 if you're fighting it in a white map. Likewise, Conley the Unrepentant has a life figure of 340%. So all it really matters is that the Stone of the Currents has about 15% more hit points than Conley the Unrepentant does. However, these stats are known also for the true endgame bosses, and they are much higher. So where typical map bosses have hit points in the 300 to 600% range, typical rogue exiles in the 108 to 125% range, endgame mini bosses like the Guardian of the Phoenix have hit points in the 1200% range, and off-Atlas big bosses like the Shaper exceed 2500%. So the only bosses that you'll encounter that will have more hit points than the Shaper does, if the Shaper shows up in one of your progression steps, will be late game act bosses. So Depraved Trinity has 4700% hit points from memory, and that gives you a bit of a sense as to just how tanky those bosses are. I think Katava in Act 10 has something like 7000%. But otherwise, the Shaper is going to feel as tanky as anything short of the Depraved Trinity while you're leveling. For that reason, you probably don't really want to fight the Shaper when you encounter him early on. You're just going to want to run past. But you are going to need to have the capability to fight these bosses, and as a result, you're going to need heavy boss DPS. Boss notes too, we don't know how rare the bigger bosses will be. So you might almost never have maps or story zones invaded by endgame bosses like the Synthete Nightmare or endgame mini-bosses like the Guardian of the Hydra. But with 100-ish map bosses and 17 Uncharted bosses, unless there is a heavy bias against Uncharted bosses, you should expect an Uncharted boss in many of your maps. And these things are going to be tanky, you know, like Guardian of the Hydra, 1000% life. Synthete Nightmare, 810% life plus 500% energy shield. Shaper, 25-60% life. These things are tanky. They're like a map boss with its hit points multiplied by a large number, like 5 or so. So for the Witch, what can I suggest here? For the Elementalist, I think you want to go Detonate, Dead Ignite. This is the highest DPS that you're going to get on the Elementalist Ascendancy, and it can be played moderately with a safe playstyle. Not necessarily super tanky, but you can play it with a safe playstyle. You can adapt this build to other Ascendancies like the Necromancer or the Chieftain, and in fact we will be recommending this for the Chieftain as well. For the Occultist, Poisonous Concoction. It has adequate clear. Its clear is actually better if you play it as a Pathfinder, but it's got much better bossing when you play it as an Occultist. Slow ramp up of damage, but it gets the damage out there. There's a reason that this is one of the top Ascendancies and one of the top builds for people that have killed Cyrus in hardcore solo self-found in the Scourge League. For the Necromancer, I think the Summoner is in a really good place. Like any sort of Summoner here, you can go Skeleton Mages, you can go Melee Skeletons, you can go Spectres, lots of different options, and I think the Necromancer will be a popular Ascendancy there. It's always solid, even when it's not as, it's not the best build in the game like it was in 3.15, but it's in a pretty strong place, whichever one of these ways you decide to go. So for the Shadow, you're going to see here that we're going to be skipping some Ascendancies. Sorry, Assassin and Trickster fans, I just can't recommend anything here. Trickster is in a weak place. You can get away with that in the Scourge League. You can get away with that in Endless Heist. I think it's going to be a lot harder to get away with it in the Atlas Invasion event, just because the demands on your character are going to be so much higher. However, Saboteur Seismic Trap will be the best possible build for this event. The Poison version with duration scaling is likely the very best version because you're going to be facing a lot more 50+ million hit point monsters than you usually do, and the best version of the Seismic Trapper for killing 50 million hit point bosses is the Poison Seismic Trapper. However, hit-based physical damage is fine, hit-based cold conversion is fine, you can probably make hit-based lightning conversion work pretty well too, and I think that this will be an adaptable build for many other Ascendancies, and it may win Demigod's authorities in other Ascendancies as well. So it might be that the best Assassin build in this event is going to just be a scuffed version of the Seismic Trap Saboteur. It might be that the best Trickster build is a scuffed version of the Seismic Trap Saboteur, and I think that may well end up cleaning up a bunch of the different demigod races. So for the Ranger, Deadeye, I've got no real suggestions here. The Ascendancy isn't bad, but this event does not play to its strengths while it punishes its weaknesses. But if you must play it, Mirage Archer and Occupying Force feel like the way to go. But I'm not actually making that as a recommendation. I'm just saying that if you must play a Deadeye, that's probably what you would do. For the Raider, Raider is so all-around strong you can play basically anything as a Raider and make it work well. But Vaal Lightning Strike is in a really good place, and that's going to be my recommendation here. Vaal Lightning Strike Raider can be built a lot of different ways. There's a lot of them to have a look at, like people that have been successful in the Scourge League playing Vaal Lightning Strike Raiders have done it a bunch of different ways. But Vaal Lightning Strike just gives you that extra punch for when you're fighting a monster that's at the tankier end. I think that the March of the Legion versions of this build are probably the best, but March of the Legion is going to be a pretty hard item to get in a 1-week event, or in a 10-day event, sorry, but a 10-day event where everyone is going to want the item. For Pathfinder, I've just genuinely got no suggestions here. I would have said Poisonous Concoction again, but I think that the Occultist is just better at single target for that build. And I don't think that the Pathfinder's strengths play all that well to this event. You can make a Pathfinder work, but you're going to need to pick up some pretty good gear to do so. Scion Ascendant is next, and it's the second best Ascendancy for the Physical Trapper archetype, so play the Physical Trapper archetype. It's going to be built a lot of different ways, and I won't advocate one specific one. Just check out builds that did well in the Gauntlet event and over on POE.ninja, and then if you're playing in softcore, then go more glass cannons, so less tanky and more damage. Generally, this requires the Magebane passive tree keystone in order to cap spell suppression. So Magebane is the one that converts the benefit from dexterity away from giving you more evasion rating and into giving you spell suppression instead. Magebane is really good on this build, and I think that you should definitely take it if you are playing the Scion Ascendant version of the Physical Trapper. But this is a good build. As I say, it's the second best Ascendancy for the best build in the league, and therefore it's something that should be pretty good. A bunch of people did well with this in the Gauntlet event. For the Duelist, the Slayer is a champion but a bit worse. Any champion build can work, but will be a little bit weaker than a champion would be. For the champion, I'm going to recommend Spectral Helix here. This did really well in Gauntlet, and unlike Toxic Rain, it can do a bit more damage, and that's something that's going to be important in this event. Toxic Rain is a really good build for clearing trash monsters, but it does suffer a bit when you're trying to kill tougher unique monsters, and this event is going to have a lot more of those tough unique monsters to fight. So for that reason, I'm going to favour Spectral Helix as my recommendation for champion. That said, don't let me talk you out of playing Toxic Rain. It's still a good build. It's just something that I think is probably the second best choice for champion here. For Gladiator, shield skills again are going to be the way to go. This is either Spectral Shield Throw or Shield Crush. You can use this with Bleed Explosions, and Lionized Remorse is something that should be pretty easy to pick up. This is actually the same thing I recommended for Endless Heist. I don't think it plays as well as it does in Endless Heist, but it is something that can definitely be effective here. Do remember that you're going to need to build a bit more damage than you normally would, and you might also find that a Gladiator is... you might want to avoid some of the super durable bosses like the Shaper. You might want to just skip those when they come up in your maps, but you'll have the defenses to be able to disengage safely. One thing I will add for the Gladiator, have a disengagement plan though. This probably means Decoy Totem, and just be aware, especially if you're playing in hardcore, of maps that have enemies can't be taunted, because they will prevent you from disengaging with Decoy Totem. When I say disengagement plan, I mean you drop down Decoy Totem and then you just get the hell out of there so that the monsters can't, so that the boss in question doesn't follow you until you're 2 screens away, and then at that point they can't follow you anymore. For Marauder, Juggernaut, I'm just going to make no suggestions here. I don't think that the builds that can do a lot of damage on Juggernaut take a lot of gearing up. So this is things like the Accuracy Stacker, and while Juggernaut can endure quite a bit of pain, I think Champion does that just as well, and Juggernaut really just doesn't have the damage that I would be comfortable taking into this event early on. If you were to insist on playing it, you could try to make some of the really broken builds from Scourge League, like the trauma stacking builds that use the Replica Eternity Shroud, but I think that that's going to be something that very, very few people are able to get together. Replica Eternity Shroud is a genuinely really rare item, and so you're probably not going to come across one. So that's just, that's something you could consider, but I don't think you're going to be able to put it off unless you are a power gamer, probably with a whole group of people behind you in trade, in which case you know that you're able to make that work. For Chieftain, Detonate Dead Ignite is going to be the way I'm going to suggest you go here. You're going to need to get Ignite Chance. You don't get this for free the way that an Elementalist does, but you'll be playing in probably a less competitive Ascendancy, which is good if you are competing for a Demigod's Authority. For Berserker, Lightning Strike is going to get the nod again. It's great on many Ascendancies, and I'm going to suggest it here as one of the better options. For Templar, I'm going to start by saying for the Guardian, I've got no suggestions here. Inquisitor, Righteous Fire is an option. It's very safe because you have tremendous regeneration, but it does have a low damage output. That's going to mean, again, that you'll need disengagement plans. Like the Gladiator, you'll need disengagement plans for bosses like the Shaper, and you're probably going to want to not run monsters can't be taunted maps, or you're going to want to be very careful in those. For the Hierophant, though, I want to suggest something that's really different, that's a cool build that's been doing the rounds. This is an Iron Commander build, so it uses Ballista Totems, and it's something that just should match well to this event's demands, I think. It actually primarily scales added cold support damage. So if you can get your hands on an Awakened added cold damage support, that would be fantastic. That's going to be out of most players' reach during a short event, but level 20 added cold, or level 21 ideally, will be good enough to get the job to get the thing rolling. And this just seems like it's a pretty solid build because you're able to have your damage coming from multiple different sources, and also your damage isn't coming from you. You can break line of sight against dangerous bosses, and particularly against unfamiliar bosses. A lot of players that are running this event will have very little experience in fighting things like the Synthete Nightmare from the Cortex, or various other synthesis bosses. They'll have unfamiliar abilities and will scale up nicely with map mods. So this is going to be a build that's really good at fighting a boss you just don't know the mechanics of well. So that's something that I can recommend there as well. Damage on it isn't spectacular, but it's adequate. And that's really all I got on this. If you've got any comments or questions, definitely fire away below. Otherwise, may your Vaal have interesting results, and I will see you in the Atlas Invasion event.